All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos. And tonight, I want to talk to you guys a little bit about drug mysticism, providing a paradigmatic and a historical overview of the utilization of inebriating substances within ritualistic purposes from the Eleusinian mysteries to Aleister Crowley. And so tonight's stream is a half and half. So we'll only be presenting half of tonight's content. The other half will be present up over at the website, just like we did for the Immanuel Kant stream, in which we discussed the Kantian turn in philosophy and how Kant's critique of pure reason related to the general study of metaphysics, epistemology, how we can know reality and all that stuff. Again, and that second half video is already up over on the website. But tonight, we're going to be looking at another paper that I wrote during my doctoral program on drug mysticism. And so I want to discuss what exactly the spiritual paradigm for the use of, and proponents would call it entheogens, psychedelic spirituality, psychedelic mysticism, drug mysticism, all these types of things, and how they are indeed ancient practices. But as some of you guys know, with my research, whether it be the Psychedelic Gospels by Dr. Jerry Brown and his wife, Julie Brown, looking at the appearances, or could be John Marco Allegro in the Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, these various interpretations that may say, well, Jesus Christ or Christianity is basically a form of psychedelic religion. Look at the Eucharist, or look at the ritualistic use of inebriating substances. Not quite. And so my argument is going to lay out how these are very different spiritual paradigms, not arguing that psychedelic substances or inebriating substances haven't emerged within heretical Christian traditions. Of course, they have. And this is where, again, I've gone back and forth many times with Dr. Jerry Brown, and highlighting that, when you look at the various frescoes in, be it France, Germany, Northern Italy, Turkey, that would insinuate whether it be the Amanita muscaria or sort of a psilocybin form, mushroom variation, they always are related to a Gnostic group. And Gnosticism is not the same thing as Christianity proper. And this is a subtlety, I think, for some people who make the claim that, oh, Jesus Christ was actually a mushroom. He's not a historical person. He's certainly, for those disbelievers, he's not God incarnate or whatnot. The problem with equating Gnostic practices, because I do agree with the idea of, and in fact, in the paper we'll be reading today, I highlight groups like the Borborites, the Carpocratians, the Paulicians. All these are various Gnostic groups that were present during the first few centuries that the church was trying to establish their theology. Of course, then Orthodox Christianity is going to then emerge as a single-fied doctrine through the 7 ecumenical councils. However, the church, the Orthodox Church, the true historical church, is there, right there in the book of Acts, right from the beginning. And so the idea that we're going to utilize spiritual prowesses or practices for the attainment of of Gnosis is not the same spiritual paradigm of Orthodox Christianity. So I want to lay out what exactly is what I would call the psychedelic paradigm or the psychedelic mystical paradigm. And all the substances we're going to talk today, not all of them are generally speaking psychedelic. Now, we're going to end our conversation today and regarding my paper. We're going to end it as soon as we get into the Renaissance. And so that is really the fall of the Byzantine Empire when the Ottoman conquest occurred, 1453. That is generally the sort of demarcation on the entrance into modernity. And we have the Renaissance there. And of course, the Italian Renaissance there in Florence, Italy, Marsilio Ficino, the translation of the Hermetic Corpus, all these things are going to then reorient the sort of Christian landscape for the 15th century or for the 16th century, the 1500s, to be this very magical century where we get John Dee, alchemy, Paracelsus. And we're going to see the use, in my paper, talks about the use of opium, the use of various tinctures and substances, plant substances, even in witchcraft and stuff like that. So not all of them are explicitly psychedelics as the general definition is, but what is the psychedelic mystical paradigm and how is that different than the Orthodox Christian spiritual paradigm? Well, the psychedelic paradigm this is where I would agree with somebody like Terence McKenna. Obviously, I was big into psychedelics. And in fact, I'm actually dual streaming this stream over to my old YouTube channel, which was called Fractal Universe. And I'm going to start engaging with a lot of people who may still be in a psychedelic spiritual paradigm and going back and forth. So we hope to do an open panel this Friday on Do Psychedelics Lead to Enlightenment? But I would agree with Terence McKenna that psychedelics, generally speaking, dissolve boundaries. Now, this obviously occurs at a phenomenological level when you're under the aegis of a substance, that there is a phenomenological dissolution of a boundary between you and another person. We're all one. The world's all one. I'm God, or whatever it may be. And so this dissolution of boundaries is really essential in regards to understanding the philosophical paradigm and many of the presuppositions that then are going to form and give contour to what exactly it is. So, for example, the Platonic privileging of unity over multiplicity is indicative. It's indicative of the psychedelic paradigm, generally speaking. So we've talked about this before, this idea that oneness or pure unity is always better than multiplicity. This is going back to the ancient philosophical debate between the one and the many. Which one's more real? Which one's more primary? The one or the many? Which one is it? And so when we look at psychedelics and when we look at any sort of spirituality, and New Age spirituality would also fall into this worldview as well, it's going to privilege this idea of pure unity, which is going to color some of the cultural aspects that we see in regards to why the general tone of psychedelic mysticism, or their proponents of, be it somebody like an Aubrey Marcus, the CEO of On It, Friends of Joe Rogan. It's going to privilege the goddess worship. It's going to privilege the idea that we're all one. We need to get back and even get into a sort of global world order. Not that they would articulate it as they're promoting the New World Order, but we'll talk about feminism, goddess worship, anti-patriarchy, depopulation, UFOs, transhumanism. I want to mention all that stuff in a second. But this Gnostic enlightenment, what exactly is enlightenment in a psychedelic paradigm? And it is this the acquisition of spiritual knowledge, gnosis. And obviously, when I highlight in this paper and talk specifically about Gnosticism, there's going to be many differences between Gnosticism proper, which isn't a single thing, by the way. There's many, many, many variations of Gnosticism, many different schools competing with each other, be it the Valentinians or the Orphites or the Borborites or the Carpocratians or the Paulicians or whoever it may be, the Simonians. But it's Gnostic in the sense that it's looking for the attaining and the conceptualization of some type of spiritual knowledge. Now, this could be through the DMT experience, ayahuasca, LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, all of which back in the day I had quite the quite the experiences with. And I'm going to end this whole conversation with actually why I got out of the whole psychedelic spiritual paradigm. But this Gnostic enlightenment is going to be essential to understanding what exactly the spiritual framework of the worldview is and how one attains enlightenment. Is it through a strict moral structure? No, not really, because they promote orgiastic activity, multiplicity of sexual partners. There's not like a formalization in forms of psychedelic spirituality of no premarital sex or something like that. So again, this is going to be a subtle distinction between the Christian paradigm where there isn't a how exactly do you go about reaching illumination? Because both paradigms, again, we're talking about orthodoxy, which is all about the deification of man through Christ and the participation in the uncreated energies. How exactly do we go about attaining one's illumination? And for Orthodox Christianity, it's going to be these uncreated energies, a moral dictates in regards to how one lives their life. For psychedelics, it's going to be about gnosis, knowledge. Could be personal experiences during sex, could be personal experiences during orgies, could be personal experience during life, but especially during the intoxicated periods or the ecstasy or the ecstasis that's experienced on the drugs. This then ties into a different way in which man is deified. I've talked about before, many spiritual paradigms talk about the deification of man, and there's generally two approaches. Now, Orthodox Christianity is explicit that God became a man so man can become a God. This is different than from Catholicism or Protestantism or what we would describe as Western spirituality. Yes, they have doctrines like sanctification, but it's certainly not the same thing as Orthodox Christianity, where they are explicit that theosis is the purpose of the incarnation, that God incarnated as a man so that he, fully God, fully man, would fuse the natures, right? The unity, we're all human. What unifies us? Human nature, divine nature in a single hypostatization, in a single person. Psychedelic spirituality is much more focused on what's described as apotheosis. And I've written about this academically and described it as theosis is the framework of the God-man. God became man, and then men can participate in this process by following Christ. Apotheosis, this would describe Gnosticism. This would describe many esoteric, alchemical, occult forms of spirituality. If you want to use the frame Luciferian, again, that's very different than Satanism. Satanism is something totally different. Luciferianism has to do with, again, secret knowledge, having something that illuminates oneself. And that apotheosis as opposed to theosis is the way in which somebody becomes deified. And so within the psychedelic spirituality, there's this privileging of unity over multiplicity, this privileging of gnosis, spiritual knowledge or spiritual experience, as the way in which one becomes deified through the apotheotic process. Apotheosis is how man becomes God as opposed to the God becoming man. So theosis, apotheosis, one is much more existential in the sense that you are through your own will. This, we could see something like Thelema and Crowley's Thelema point towards an apotheotic process. And this, I would think, would characterize also the psychedelic spirituality, because I don't disagree. I do not disagree that spirituality and historically the purpose is for the deification of man and mankind, men and women. But how do you go about the deification process is a point of contention between these two worldviews. So I would say then Henosis is the term that describes an apotheotic process that privileges unity over multiplicity. Henosis is a really useful term for those of you who aren't familiar. It's Henosis, and it's a Neoplatonic term. So Neoplatonism is going to play much more favorably to the psychedelic paradigm than something like Orthodoxy or Christianity, which is going to maintain, it's more of a both and spirituality that's going to maintain the one and the many, where Neoplatonism is all about the monad. It's all about the one. It's all about returning back to source or the one. And so the way one does that, well, there's many different ways in Neoplatonism. They had ritualistic magic. They had propositional knowledge. And so one, usually Neoplatonic, again, whoever you read, whether it be Iamblichus or Porphyry or Plotinus, they're all different actually, but Neoplatonism, generally speaking, has a worldview that believes that God is basically a dot, and then there's concentric circles around that dot. We then live on the periphery, the furthest circle of this concentric circle ring, and this is the material world that we live in. And we can then perform practices and rituals to move us back towards source, back towards the monad, back towards the one. And therefore, pure enlightenment, or even the eschatological endpoint of history, is about pure unity with source, and that's called Henosis. And so when we look at even heretical scholars like John Scotus Erigena, who, again, I'll be doing a sponsored stream on his division of nature here. I've been reading his stuff, and he was like the leading philosopher during the Carolingian Empire. And so he was a quite learned Irish scholar, and he was trying to form a sort of synthesis of Neoplatonism and Christianity. And because this emphasis on Henosis, as opposed to theosis, when you reach eternity, if you make it to the kingdom, for him, everybody does. Everybody, and this is a heresy within Orthodoxy that is tied to Origen, who was also Neoplatonic, but that the apokatastasis, that everybody's going to make it to the kingdom. Everybody makes it to eternity. And when you make it, you are subsumed back into the one. And so therefore, your individual identity really isn't that important. And I would say this is also a presupposition, not that people who take psychedelics or have these mystical experiences are thinking about philosophy in these ways, but the idea when people get inebriated and say, you know what, we're all one. I had this fascinating experience that I'm me and I'm you and we're all one. There's one consciousness, all this different stuff. That's very Neoplatonic, because Orthodoxy is going to push against this idea of the dissolution of personhood, the dissolution of the individual identity of a person, because this is central to the understanding of the Trinity. Where in Neoplatonism, this is really, really important, that we realize that we aren't really who we think we are, and that once we merge with God, we merge with the essence of God. That's just what Erigena was even talking about. So the psychedelic paradigm privileges unity over multiplicity, Neoplatonic. We can see that Platonic presupposition, Gnostic in its framework in regards to how somebody attains enlightenment, Henosis in regards to how somebody unifies with divinity. And of course, then this leads to the realization that you are God. And generally speaking, the psychedelic paradigm, although when we look in history, could be the Eleusinian mysteries, that was obviously going to have a relationship to Demeter and Persephone. You can look at ayahuasquero tribes in the Amazon. They may have various animalistic or, grandmother ayahuasca deities, but generally their framework's not going to have the same framework of how they relate to God. And therefore, you are the multiplicity of God. You are the personal form of God. You are God's personhood. And now, again, this is different from the Trinity, where we believe there's a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Logos being that second person. That personhood, being made in the image as we are, gives us the image of God. We have personhood. Personhood allows us to engage in these uncreated energies like logic, reason, truth, love, compassion, mercy, honor, glory. None of these things you can touch. All these things separate us from the animals. And Orthodox Christianity says, yes, the reason you can participate in those is because you have the imago Dei. You are made in the image of God. Psychedelic spirituality is going to say you are God. There isn't this idea that you're made in the image. You are the conscious, you can say a pantheist or a panentheistic understanding that you are God incarnate. You are God experiencing creation, something of this sort. So again, the way we understand personhood, again, it's a different paradigm. So we are one. The ego and personhood is generally described as sort of an illusory psychological construct in the mind of the person. I know Terence McKenna talked about the dominator male ego, and he generally associated the ego with a privileging of patriarchy, of paternalism, in that this was a negative, a sort of a psychological detritus that's holding humanity back, and that the psychedelics would then eviscerate this egoic structure, this male-dominated structure, And therefore, this would return us back to a sort of goddess-oriented, nature-oriented spirituality. And so the ego, again, is tied with the person and is going to separate orthodoxy from a spiritual or a psychedelic spirituality, because in orthodoxy, your ego is important. Your ego, your individual identity, your individual name is important. And when you make it to eternity, all this stuff is going to be maintained, right? So the way in which these two worldviews are going to understand personhood, the psychedelic spirit paradigm is going to adopt something more of an Eastern mystical understanding, that the idea of who you are is illusory. You could call it Maya if you want to use Sanskrit in a Hindu context or a Dharmic religion context. And that would, I feel like that'd be fairly appropriate. So psychedelic spirituality often adopts more of a framework in which we are all, humanity is all one, animals, everything that is sentient to some degree, even though there may be a spectrum of sentience or consciousness. All of us are connected. We're all the same thing. And this is where they'll get into utilization of something like consciousness, cosmic consciousness, or even interpret Christ as the cosmic Christ. They'll take an Aryan Christology and then claim that he was fully illuminated, something of this nature. So also, the psychedelic paradigm does not have a single defined morality. And this is true when you look at, you can look at various specific psychedelic traditions. So if you look at an ayahuasquero tribe in the Amazon, they may have a sort of culturally constructed set of moral strictures that they've agreed upon. You can look at, obviously, when we look at Eleusis, ancient Greece had their own sort of culturally constructed structure of morality and ethics, but they're not agree across each other. So once you start looking at whether it be the Soma cults of the Rig Veda or the Mithra cults or the Gnostic cults that we're going to be talking about today, or the Eleusinian mysteries, or you get into Aleister Crowley and Thelema at the beginning of the 20th century into the 19th century, none of them have the same moral structure. And so the idea that one unifies with God through morality isn't going to be of a strong emphasis for the psychedelic paradigm as it will be for the Orthodox Christian paradigm. And so at the same time, a point of agreement would be the realization of a sort of spiritual, non-physical reality. So I think most people who've done high dose psychedelics, be it their 5 dried grams or 8 dried grams, I did way back in the day, or you take DMT or ayahuasca or whatever substance is your thing, many people will believe that there is actually a non-local, non-physical spiritual reality that's around us, surrounding us, and is here present with us. The question then is, are all spirits good? Are there such thing as bad spirits? Is there such thing as evil? And how does one know that is the case? And how does one know which is good and which is bad? Again, this gets back to the epistemic basis of how one epistemically justifies their moral and ethical strictures. And so for psychedelic spirituality, generally speaking, I think it's going to be more culturally determined which is a good one, which is a bad spirit. Although I have heard some people talk about, well, there is no such thing as evil. It's just like misunderstanding. And you ultimately, even if you were to kill somebody, you can't kill them because we're all God. I've heard this framework. I've heard people say, no, there are strict, absolute, objective moral structures, X, Y, Z. Or I've heard people take often a libertarian emphasis on, well, as long as you don't hurt somebody, then it's permissible. Then the question is, what exactly is harm? What is the definition of harm if you're going to get into a sort of philosophical justification for that? And then generally speaking, the psychedelic spiritual paradigm, generally speaking, especially in the Western context, if we're talking about since R. Gordon Wasson, his 1957 Life magazine article forward, it's pretty anti-hierarchy. So psychedelics are believed by many of the proponents to be a sort of democratization of the mystical experience. And I'm going to get into why I think psychedelic spirituality is so popular, because it does offer immediate mystical access in the contemporary period, especially after the cultural malaise of Protestantism and, big consumer capitalism here in the West. I mean, obviously there's much of a cultural malaise. I'll get into that here in a few, but generally speaking, the psychedelic spirituality is anti-hierarchy, anti-patriarchy. And this, again, I would say, generally speaking, the dissolution of boundaries makes sense why they would privilege unity over multiplicity, because it dissolves boundaries. The dissolution of boundaries makes sense why then Henosis is the spiritual framework in regard to the unification with divinity. The dissolution of boundaries makes sense in regards to why the ego then is a inhibition to the full realization of who one is. And it makes sense why then hierarchy and patriarchy would be antagonistic to psychedelic spirituality, because masculinity, generally speaking, is defined by the upholding and the maintaining of boundaries. And I'll get to that in just a second. Another thing that's going to separate these two worldviews is intoxication and ecstasy. Now, I would, again, even though I do not support or participate in psychedelics anymore, I would definitely say that it's incredibly fun, ecstatic, really, really exciting experiences you can have, especially when you're young. But the question, in regards to how one comes to know something, that the psychedelic worldview is going to privilege subjective, personal, lived experience over things like syllogistic logic, abstract forms of mathematics, these types of ways in which we go about proving something to be true or false. That's going to be less of an interest for the psychedelic spiritual paradigm, generally speaking, compared to one more rooted in a hierarchy, a patriarchy, or this boundary maintaining process. And so because the boundary dissolution is there, it makes sense why psychedelic spirituality is very perennialistic. And I mean the idea that all religions lead to the same mountaintop. Now, this, unfortunately, again, that has no epistemic basis. I've talked about this before, as I myself was perennialistic for a very long time. I remember going through all my psychedelic experiences. I remember going through high dose mushroom, psilocybin mushroom experiences. And I was studying, and again, my PhD is in religious studies. And I was certainly not subscribed to any one tradition. I would describe myself as spiritual, not religious back then. And I remember always saying, well, look, all these religions are man-made, they're culturally constructed, they're variations on how we then relate or understand transcendence, divinity, God, this type of thing. However, it wasn't until I got more serious philosophically, and I said, well, that can't be the case, because one is anti-real in regards to the exterior world or the physical world, and another one's very, real. One is, against this behavioral pattern, and one is for it. And you start going through the differences between spiritual paradigms, and there's a lot more differences than there are unity. Although there are general unities or general commonalities between the various major world religions, be it paganism, Hinduism, Shintoism in Japan, Christianity and its variations. But anyways, I digress. So I would say that intoxication, certainly Orthodox Christianity being a patriarchal, hierarchical framework of religion and spirituality, it's going to be more sober-minded than the psychedelic paradigm, which is going to be more privileging of the feminine, goddess worship. Again, the dissolution of boundaries between religions, dissolution of boundaries between self and other, dissolution of boundaries between self and God, all these things that I've laid out already, leading to then why they privilege unity over multiplicity in regards to the basic philosophical level between the one and the many. So it's a feminine paradigm. In regards to Orthodox Christianity, I would say it's a boundary maintaining paradigm. And the reason for is that it's a both and spirituality. When we get into debates between the one and the many, going back to Plato, what's more real? The category of dog nature, dog essence, or for Aristotle, dog substance? Or is it that there's German shepherds, pit bulls, chihuahuas, wolves, and whatnot? What's more real? The dog that I can touch, the dog that I can have in my lap and touch, or the category of dog nature, the thing that unifies all these various dogs? For Plato, it was the category, it was the ideal, it was the form, it was the essence, the ideal form. And so for Orthodox Christianity, obviously it's the Logos theology. We believe that the Logos incarnated, and we believe that it's both and. It's both and. We don't have this dialectical tension, which is characteristic of the entire Western philosophical tradition, be it from the Greeks to the Romans, the Stoics to the Neoplatonists, all the way then to the beginning of scholasticism with the Catholic tradition. Dialectics and dialectical tension between these two things has been characteristic of that philosophy. For Aristotle, the multiplicity was more real. You begin your philosophy through induction. You begin your philosophy through the observation of the world. For Plato said, no, you begin with the a priori categories and you do deduction from there. Orthodoxy says, no, it's both and. We don't take a step or privileging one over the other. And then in regards to what is enlightenment, enlightenment is personified. Again, so enlightenment isn't, again, for the psychedelic paradigm, I characterize it as Gnostic in the sense that it's about the acquisition of secret knowledge, gnosis, however that may be, maybe through sexual rituals, as we'll see with the Gnostics of old, of various groups, again, the Borborites, the Carpocratians specifically, or it could be ritualistic processes like the Simonians that would do various Egyptian or forms of various rituals for the acquisition of spiritual knowledge. For Orthodox Christianity, it's about following Jesus Christ, because the idea here is that the logos, the metaphysical basis of reality, that which unifies all things, that which is the source of the essences of the ideal categories, right? Now, again, we're not Platonic. We understand these categories as divine principles, the logi, but that he incarnated as a man to unify divine nature and human nature, lived a perfect life, defeated death, and ascended, and that we then follow that path. Enlightenment then is characterized by our participation in what's called the uncreated energies. One of the things that would differentiate when you start to look at spiritual worldviews, you can look at what spiritual paradigm gives cataphatic, meaning positive descriptions to the essence of God. And orthodoxy is explicit that we do not give cataphatic, positive explanations in regards to the essence of God. We say the essence of God is totally unknowable. But what we do, so then another question is, for example, if you ask a Catholic, and we're Orthodox Christians, but this is the subtlety of theology here. If you ask somebody, do you directly engage with God through a Thomistic worldview? The answer is no. You engage with an analogy. When you experience love as a Thomistic Catholic, you are experiencing an analogy of God's love. Now, as Orthodox, we would say, no, you're experiencing the uncreated energetic reality of love, the same love that is natural to the essence of God. And so we then engage and participate and embody the uncreated energies of God so that we can be divinized, deified by them. So the idea is that the more logical, the more rational, the more loving, the more truthful, the more compassionate, the more merciful, the more acquisition of honor, and the more pursuit of glory, these things actually deify you and make you more and more and more like Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is that bridge that allows contingent created entities to move into eternity, a category which we technically could never participate in. Again, how does something that's created participate in a category of uncreation, in eternity, in infinity, right? These things have no beginning and no end. So the way in which we get enlightenment and attain enlightenment is very different, because somebody who has Down syndrome, for example, they're going to have a bit more trouble attaining gnosis or Gnostic spiritual knowledge compared to the Orthodox worldview, where somebody who has Down syndrome or something, it's all about their heart. It's all about their morality. It's about the way they treat people. It's about the way that they live their life. This is a subtlety, but an important distinction. And so God is personal. It's a Trinitarian structure. For the psychedelics, as we said, we talked about Henosis, we talked about the divine, we've talked about divine consciousness, cosmic consciousness, something of this sort. It's abstract. It's not personified. The personification of God in the psychedelic spiritual paradigm comes by way of the individual who becomes illuminated through the gnosis, you see. Therefore, then he realigns through Henosis, the ultimate unity, back with God. That's the idea. For orthodoxy, it's all about personhood. And so the Trinity is personal. The Trinity is three persons, one essence. That's the only cataphatic claim that the Orthodox Church makes about the Godhead, is that it's one essence, three persons, not three gods, but three persons. And therefore, it's both one and many. You see, it gets back to that spiritual paradigm that's a both and. Orthodoxy's both and. It's both one essence and it's many persons. It's not a privileging of one over the other. Whereas, for example, if you were in a debate with a Muslim, for example, you could levy this at their understanding of Allah, because Islam, due to the Arabian conquest of the Persians and converting what we would call today Iran to Islam, you eventually get the golden era of Islam, which is the Persian golden era, because Persians already had high culture, the Arabs did not. And you see all these Persians develop a sort of Neoplatonic framework, theologizing and understanding Allah. And so within Islam, Allah is singular, and Allah is much more of a Neoplatonic framework than a understanding of a Trinity. And so therefore, is it the same God? No, it's not the same God. A Trinitarian understanding of the Godhead is different than the Jewish understanding. Yes, maybe both groups call God Yahweh, but the way they understand it is different. It's not the same God. It's not one essence, three persons. Same thing with the Muslims. Even though they're generally described people of the book, they're not worshiping the same God. And so personhood is extremely important, because we are made in the image of God. That's where we get our personhood. And as I said before in many streams, we engage with each other at a personal level. You don't know who I am. I don't know who you are. You don't know. Again, you think about somebody in your life, one of your close friends, maybe your family members. The way we come to know other people is through energies, just like I said, these uncreated energies of God. So you only know who your best friend is through all the experiences you had, everything he said, everything they've done, the way they dress, the way they move, the way they treat people. All this are energetic expressions of the essence and nature of who they are. That's how persons made in the image come to know other persons, through energies. And that's the same theology of how we come to understand the Trinity, three persons, one essence, through these uncreated energies. And so we maintain personhood into eternity, where I said Henosis, the Neoplatonic framework, the individual person dissolves back into God, that ultimately your personhood isn't really real. And this is where, for somebody that's of the psychedelic spiritual paradigm, if you believe that, at least they're consistent with the idea that if you attain a certain amount or special gnosis, that you then become enlightened, and that you realize that you're all one, and that if you were to be subsumed back into God, that this idea that I'm David Patrick Carey, that's an illusion, that's unimportant. Within the Orthodox Christian worldview, that's very, very important, because you maintain your personhood into eternity for infinity. It's very different. So, like I said, the Christian worldview then is going to be very hierarchical. It's going to be very patriarchal, and it's going to be more sober-minded. And this is where, again, I've gone back and forth privately with Dr. Jerry Brown of the Psychedelic Gospels, and talked about how, the idea at one point he makes a reference that maybe the psychedelic mushrooms were the basis for the Eucharistic activity. And I agree with him that for certain groups like the Cathars of southern France and northern Italy during the Cathar heresy, which again is Gnostic, I believe that they really were. So when he finds these various frescoes that are, demonstrating what appears to be the Amanita muscaria mushroom in places like St. Michael's Cathedral. There we go. Like there's one in St. Michael's. This is a depiction of Adam and Eve. Clearly looks like they're eating of the Amanita muscaria mushroom. And he has various references. This is a church in France where we see them cutting down mushrooms at the Last Supper here. Do I believe that there were some heretical groups that were engaging in these activities? Yeah, I do. But that's not the same thing as saying Christianity proper was actually a psychedelic religion. That is a step too far. That does not take into account the philosophical and theological nuances of paradigms and why people do the things they do. The Eucharist is explicitly understood as the body and blood of Christ, and is not an ecstatic experience. The point is not the acquisition of gnosis. The point is not to become inebriated in any sense. Were there groups that did that? Yes, there were. Absolutely. I do agree with that. But generally speaking, it's a sober-minded spirituality. Alcohol, tobacco, those are basically the things that are okay. But even getting drunk is a sin. You're not supposed to get totally intoxicated. You can, drink your malt whiskey, smoke your cigar. But if you were to become a belligerent drunk, that's sinful. That's a transgression of the boundary. As I said, this spirituality is a boundary maintaining spiritual paradigm. And so the way that Jacques Derrida, the 1960s French intellectual, in his famous book Grammatology, the way he framed it is that the central pillar of Christianity is what he called foul logocentrism, the privileging of the phallus, or the masculine, or the patriarchy, the privileging of logos. Remember, this Greek philosophical concept that begins with Heraclitus, goes through Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics and Neoplatonism and all these different groups. John, in the Gospel of John, in arche in ho logos, in the beginning was the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God, is showing that the Messiah, the Mashiach that is prophesied throughout the Old Testament is in fact the concept of the demiurge that's present within Greek philosophy. Again, for the Neoplatonists and even contemporary Neoplatonists, they believe that the Logos is the first creation of God. Christianity is saying, no, he's begotten and of the same essence. Again, this is a philosophical argument that's very nuanced, but they're claiming that, no, actually the Logos is not created. He's uncreated, and it's the Godhead itself is 3 in 1. So in the beginning was the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. It's articulating a different paradigm that is foul logocentric. And so Derrida, being a leftist French intellectual, he wanted to undermine, and he thought the best way, if we're going to undermine the Christian paradigm and destroy Christian or undermine Christian culture, we need to become feminine oriented as opposed to phallus oriented or patriarchally oriented, and be anti-logos, be against consistent forms of logic, be against objective forms of morality, be against the idea that we have to just philosophically justify our epistemology. And instead, let's privilege the marginal. And so the idea, as he talks about, is to privilege the marginal over the majority or the center. You see, Christianity is foul logocentric. And he said, what we need to do is privilege on, the homosexual, the female, the feminist, aberrant forms of self-expression, and then make that the new center. So make the marginal the new center. And this is, again, a different form of spirituality. So the foul logocentric is essential to the Orthodox paradigm. And then logos theology, the incarnation of that logos, then you can understand, again, that's where the Gospels and the New Testament then comes into play to then lay explanation to the incarnation of the logos, this metaphysical reality in God himself. And so love your neighbor as yourself is indicative of the idea that both you take a high dose LSD experience. Yeah, you're going to realize that, man, all of us are the same, or all of humans are united. Men and women are united. There's a shared human experience here. Agreed. But you're not all the same person, or you're not all cosmic consciousness experiencing itself in different bodies. What I would argue is that Orthodox Christianity says, love your neighbor as yourself, because it's highlighting on that shared experience. You can know something about your neighbor through your own lived experience, but you love them separately. You're not all the same person. The idea that you are who you are is not an illusion. It's a reality, and that should be maintained and privileged. And therefore, there's a emphasis on your ego or yourself to then make sure you make the right choice. And that then ties to my final point that's going to differentiate these spiritualities, that Orthodox Christianity is explicit, and that it is understood that morality and living a moral life is incredibly, incredibly important. It's very, very important, as opposed to the psychedelic paradigm, which it's less so, because, again, they don't really have that same singular understanding or framework for morality. Now, why is psychedelic spirituality so popular nowadays? And to give credit where credit is due, I would say that it's a natural response to the cultural malaise of the Western world. Again, Protestantism is a incredibly rationalistic form of religion, not very mystical. That's why you look at Protestantism nowadays and they have their rock band churches. They're getting up there and they're doing, drum and electric guitar solos. Why? Because this is, again, about as far as it goes in regard to the mystical experience. Psychedelics at least offered people something genuinely novel. And so psychedelics, I think, are a natural response. And this is true for the New Age. This is true for yoga. This is true for breathing techniques. This is true for, again, various forms of self-expression and identity. These are ways to respond to the Western cultural malaise and form new understandings. So I would say that Protestantism is a highly rational, non-mystical form of religion. And people wanted more. And so when R. Gordon Wasson came with his Life magazine article in 1957, people were interested. But it wasn't really until the counterculture got going that it offered a new avenue for meaning making and self-identity. And I think it was a natural, logical response to, again, the culture that people were frustrated with in general. Now, I would then also say one of the reasons why psychedelic spirituality is so popular is that it's really no longer a counterculture. It's really no longer a counterculture. It's generally accepted by the institutions. Now, if we were back in 1967, let's see, 67 was the Summer of Love in San Francisco at Haight-Ashbury. 1969 is the Summer of Woodstock in New York. So if we're back in 1967, 69, yeah, taking psychedelics and the psychedelic mystical paradigm and spirituality, very counterculture. In 2023, not very counterculture. The psychedelic paradigm goes totally consistent with the idea of feminism or radical feminism, or really choose your wave, first wave, second wave, third wave, or whatever wave we're in today. Not even trying to critique feminism as it is. We'll leave it however you understand that, but feminism in regards to a sort of new understanding of the role of women outside the idea of a nuclear family, of children, of motherhood. And so we've seen all the modern countries, look at all the first world countries, their birth rates are almost below replacement rate. In East Asia, again, they're not Christian, but they're certainly one of the worst. I think Korea is one of the worst in the world in regards to the replacement rate. But Japan, China, all of basic first world countries, most of them are below replacement rate. And so this goes hand in hand with a globalist intention for depopulation. Now, I know Terence McKenna himself, he claimed that the mushroom told him that, only, women should only have one child. And if a woman only had one child, that would dramatically reduce the global population without then sentencing people or telling people that, you can't have children or do something, whatever it was, create a new cultural standard where you only have one child. But I would argue that depopulation, generally speaking, is tied with what we're seeing as the Great Reset and the New World Order and moving towards a unified one global government world structure. So I think psychedelic spirituality goes hand in hand with the idea that the planet is overpopulated, that climate change, that humans are, again, I'm not even arguing the points here. I'm just trying to make the point that psychedelic spirituality is totally consistent with all the mainstream narratives. Global climate change is man-made caused, and that we then need to create new forms of energy production to stop our destruction of the natural environment. And therefore, we need to have less people on the planet. We need to then potentially eat the bugs, right? Dr. Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum, what's his famous? You're going to eat the bugs. You're going to own nothing, and you're going to like it, basically. If we look at some of the psychedelic speakers like Terence McKenna in the 80s and 90s, certainly he's hinting at some of these ideas. UFOs. I do not believe in UFOs. I do not believe in aliens myself. And I believe that what we're witnessing by the US government, first of all, you just look at UFO experiences. It's interesting that it's pretty localized to the United States, Canada, and Britain, or the UK. Don't know what to think about. In Israel, I don't know what to think about all that. But therefore, to me, it's something culturally constructed. I think the way that we understand the alien as a sort of savior is a sort of inversion of the idea that God would come rescue us. Again, i.e. Christianity or Logos, the Christ. So When we look at feminism, goddess worship, I mean, most people I've ever talked to, and even myself, when I was deep into the psychedelic phase that I was in, most people would express themselves as worshiping a goddess or the ideal feminine or Gaia or Mother Nature or something of this sort. So feminism, goddess worship, anti-patriarchy. I've never heard somebody that is really into psychedelics that's pro-patriarchy. Maybe the Aztecs certainly were. But that would be another one. So all these things I think are consistent with the normative narratives of our society, of our culture. Transhumanism. This is really my specialty in regards to academia. So I'm writing a dissertation on the philosophy of transhumanism, the deification of man, and how transhumanism relates to the process of theosis and orthodoxy. So looking at two different ways for self-deification. But I would say that UFOs, transhumanism, we look at Terence McKenna. He believed that he was going to be able to upload his consciousness into a computer, which we see somebody like a Ray Kurzweil of the world speculate on these things. I do not believe that's the case because my anthropology doesn't believe that you are a collection of memories. I don't believe you can be uploaded into a computer because I don't believe all you are is consciousness. I don't believe all you are is the collection of experiences you had. I think people have a soul, and I think the soul gives form to the body, and that the body gives this together gives form to a noetic faculties that we have. So I don't think man or woman can exist in a pure sort of conscious state, if you will. So I disagree with there, but we can look at Max Moore, Natasha Vita-More. These are some of the two leading philosophers regarding actual research with transhumanism. We can look at Nick Bostrom over at Oxford. And so transhumanism, the idea that we're going to be implanting microchips, moving through, blending with our technology. Now, I have met people that are psychedelic that are against some of these things. But you look at what did Timothy Leary talk about? That computers were going to replace drugs. That what did Robert Anton Wilson talk about? He was all for transhumanism. Terence McKenna, all for transhumanism. So you look at Jason Silva, all for transhumanism. You look into the spiritual paradigm, and many of these spiritual mystical advocates, almost all of them promote a transhumanist worldview. So again, I think that totally goes together. And then, of course, performative gender theory. Now, I am referencing, obviously, Judith Butler, the social theorist over at the University of Berkeley, but performative gender theory is now a sort of status quo in our culture that if I decided that I want to put a dress on today and express myself as a woman, that I am indeed a woman, and that trans women are women, right? Trans women are women. I think this is totally consistent with the psychedelic paradigm, where you look at more of a patriarchal, hierarchical form, be it Islam or obviously the one I'm a part of, Orthodox Christianity. They would not affirm that idea in the same way. So our secular culture seems to have many of the exact same values that the psychedelic spiritual paradigm has. And therefore, I would be very reluctant to characterize the use of psychedelics as counterculture. I am also familiar with, obviously, the Johns Hopkins studies. And so being as an Orthodox Christian, do you think psychedelics are evil? Well, that's a bit of a difficult question, because evil in my worldview has to have a will. I do not, unlike Terence McKenna, believe that the mushroom is alive. I don't think it has a will of its own. I do not think that it's a cosmic fungus that has infiltrated through the universe and found itself on planet Earth. I do not think that. And so, oh, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. We were talking about the will of psychedelics. So I don't think that a psychedelic in itself is evil, only that it opens you up to a real spiritual reality. So have I seen people, even when I was in psychedelics and psychedelic spirituality, have I seen people get possessed? Yeah, I have. And I guarantee you, many people that have done high dose substances in groups, with friends, people that maybe haven't done it before, you've seen something come over an individual where they become somebody that they weren't, or they're not usually. So spiritual possession, I think, is absolutely true. In regards to the Johns Hopkins studies, I do see how MDMA, or even low dose or lower dose, not your 5 drive grams, but lower dose of psilocybin does aid in the dissolution of boundaries regards to post-traumatic stress disorder. So if you have a stress, if you saw your best friend in Iraq get blown up by IED, and you take MDMA or a lower dose of psilocybin, and you're able to work through that event and come to a sort of emotional conclusion because you dissolve boundaries that you've been keeping up since that time. Yeah, I think it is cathartic. Does that mean I advocate for the use of psychedelics? No, I do not think that psychedelics are evil in and of themselves, just like I don't think technology is evil in and of itself, even though I'm against transhumanism. Nuance and subtleties there. Also, then I would say the psychedelic spiritual paradigm is pretty much in consensus with science. And so I'm very reluctant to believe the science, as we saw in 2020 with some of the medical procedures that were pushed on us by the federal government. Follow the science. You don't believe in science. Science was a justification for many people to give up their critical reasoning apparatus to analyze, well, should I get this jab or should I not? And so I would argue, if you look at MAPS, I'm talking about the institute that promotes psychedelics, I would venture that the majority of those people went and got their jibby jab. Where you look in more of a traditional, religious, patriarchal tradition, many people were reluctant to get the jab. Now, how does that connect? That'd be a different stream, but I think it's interesting nonetheless. Now, why is psychedelic spirituality so popular? It allows individuals to define their own spirituality. It allows you to explore the supermarket of spirituality and come to your own conclusions. So you can do breath work, you can do yoga, you can do Tai Chi, you can pray the rosary, and you can do all this stuff. And this is all part of your spirituality. I think that affords a sort of appeal to many people in the contemporary period, although I think it presents, again, the internal contradictions, the philosophical coherency, I think, falls apart. But I think that's one of the reasons it's so popular, is that it allows individuals to define their own spirituality. And in regards to the manosphere, now you've heard me talk very critically about Andrew Tate and Rollo Tomassi and the manosphere, but I can't help but see the manosphere in a way as a reaction, unconscious for many people, an unconscious reaction to the growing dissolution of boundaries, right? Antifa, what was it, during Trump's presidency? They said, no border, no wall, no USA at all. And the idea that we're going to dissolve national boundaries, which, if again, anybody's read The Great Reset and is familiar with the World Economic Forum, they're going to know that Dr. Klaus Schwab says he's going to divide the world up into 10 regions. Now, it's interesting, of course, the book of Revelation talks about the 10 toes of the beast, and you look at the footnotes, that's tied to the 10 regions of the world. I digress. This is not me giving my apocalyptic eschatological framework, but I think that the manosphere is an unconscious reaction to this growing dissolving boundary process that's occurring in our society, however you want to understand that, be it psychedelic or not. I'm not saying the psychedelics are dissolving our national boundaries that we hear chants through Antifa. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that psychedelic spirituality is consistent with the general dissolution of boundaries, the dissolution between man and animal, the dissolution between male and female, the dissolution between man and technology. The dissolving of these boundaries, I think, is consistent with the psychedelic paradigm. Not that the psychedelic paradigm gives way to it, but that we can see these commonalities. And I see this sort of weird form of masculinity that's presented in these sort of secular manosphere frames is really an unconscious attempt to react against it. Now, the last thing I want to say is why I stopped personally with the psychedelic spirituality. What got me out of it, And for me, I was, living in Berkeley, California. I had all the DMT I wanted, went to the ayahuasca ceremonies, underground ceremonies. They're probably more above ground now, but generally speaking. And I had access to plenty of LSD and psilocybin. And I kept doing the high doses, trying to get into these altered experiences, contact these entities. And I had a lot of strange, interesting, transformative experiences. But I felt like I eventually came to a place like, where am I going? What's the point? Do I just keep taking the drugs? Do I keep just looking for spiritual knowledge? Because I was a bit obsessed with like diving deep into the psychedelic waters. And so I, again, had a thriving YouTube channel, listening to all the Terrence McKenna stuff. And I just going deeper and deeper and deeper, more and more and more and more higher doses. And it just felt like I didn't realize what exactly I was going towards. And then this is during my doctorate program. So then I start looking a little bit deeper into my own philosophy and my own worldview. And once I saw that there was a lot of things that were coming up short, like the epistemic problems at the paradigmatic level, I believed in an objective morality. But when somebody pushed me to say, well, why is that objectively the moral case? Why is that the objective ethics? I had a real trouble justifying that within my psychedelic paradigm, because again, I was perennial. All religions lead to the same mountaintop, despite the multiplicity of metaphysical, ethical, and epistemological differences between these worldviews. I couldn't really put my finger. I couldn't say why is it objectively true? Well, that's just true for you. That's just your truth. That's just your understanding. That's just your framework. And so when I started to really dive deep into how one epistemically justifies their morality and their ethics, I realized that I do believe in certain things that aren't totally consistent with other things that people who promote psychedelics believe in. When it comes to objective truth, I do believe in objective truth. I do believe that 2 + 2 = 4, and that is in perpetuity. I do believe that the laws of logic are objectively real and they're non-physical. And so that there totally blows out any sort of atheistic worldview, because atheism is totally materialistic. And if you believe in a materialistic worldview that starts with the Big Bang and runs forward from there through various cosmological and biological forms of evolution, then the only thing that exists is physical. How exactly can you account then for number theory, logic, the law of identity, all these things that are non-physical, right? You can say, yeah, love is just a biochemical. All these things are just chemicals in your brain. But when it comes to logic, logic is objective. Syllogistic logic is objective. Where does that come from? That's not any material thing. So that's where the atheist or the materialist really struggles from an apologetic or a debate paradigm, because they can't justify the idea of objective truth. The best they can do is justify the scientific method for getting to the closest form of any sort of epistemic reliability. So the more I dove into it, the more I felt like my psychedelic worldview was totally inadequate. And then I took I did research. I was doing research on the psychedelic gospels. And this led me into thinking, man, I want to read the book. What is it called? Mushrooms, Russia, and History. It's a book by R. Gordon Wasson and his wife, Valentina Pavlovna. It's a long book. It's very expensive, but shout out to anybody watching. You can actually get a free ebook online and download it. So I got the ebook. And for me, I started looking, I was thinking, geez, okay, I'm in the psychedelics. I'm spiritual, not religious. Yeah. I'm looking at all this stuff. I'm reading this book. I came to the conclusion that, okay, so I see all these psychedelic frescoes in Western Europe, Italy, Germany, France, and Turkey. And I thought, geez, I bet, given the fact that R. Gordon Wasson's book with his wife, Valentina Pavlovna, talked about how Slavic languages are much more mushroom-philic as opposed to mushroom-phobic. So in that book, he talks about how Germany and England have very few words for mushrooms. So in English, for example, we have toadstool, fungus, and mushroom. 3 words to describe that entire species, right? Where in Russian languages and Slavic languages, generally speaking, there's tons and tons and tons of words to describe mushrooms. So I thought, geez, well, given the fact that Russia is Orthodox Christian and they have all this iconography, I bet if I go take a PhD course on Orthodox Christianity, I'll be able to study their iconography, and I bet I'll find more evidence of psychedelics. I did that. Didn't find any psychedelics within Orthodox Christianity, but what I did encounter was Orthodox theology, which is another framework you can understand it, at least the way that I approached it as a non-believer, was logos theology. And I was a non-believer taking this course on the history of the Orthodox Church, something that I wasn't very familiar with, and then looking at the intricacies and the nuance of its theology, the understanding of the logos being the metaphysical basis, the understanding of archetypes or the Platonic ideals being these logi, these divine principles in creation, looking at how God became a man so men can become gods by grace, by following in Christ, by crossing that bridge through his incarnation, his inhypostatization. Looking at all these things, really began to reshape my worldview. Now, I was still a non-believer, and I was still, waist deep into my psychedelic practice. But the more I dove into it, the more it weighed on my heart, the more and more this logos theology made sense to me. And therefore, I eventually came to a point where I started to pray. I started to pray before I went to bed. And then this led to eventually even doing more psychedelic experiences where on LSD, I experienced like, geez, all these things that I like about psychedelics, sacred geometry, fractals, the deification of man, the idea of the metaphysical unity, the logos, the use of logic, all this stuff. It made a lot more sense in the logos theological paradigm of the Orthodox Christian than my psychedelic worldview, which was a sort of amalgamation of everything that I liked and didn't like about certain worldviews. And so when it came to, again, we're all one, I thought, geez, love your neighbor as yourself. That the logos gave a metaphysical basis for language, the word, the incarnation of God. It gave a metaphysical basis for sacred geometry and Platonic solids. It gave a metaphysical basis for fractal mathematics. It gave a metaphysical basis for aesthetic beauty, objective beauty. And this was huge because, again, I was still waist deep into my psychedelic practice, but it just showed me that the worldview that I had been studying, this whole Orthodox Christianity, offered a lot of things that I liked about psychedelics, but I didn't have to give it up. I just had to reorient myself towards what I ultimately really believed deep down. And so that was then one that set me on the track. And so that's, as I wrote down, once I started to take orthodoxy seriously, there's been really no turning back from there. And so whether anybody watching this, maybe you're still in the psychedelic spirituality camp. Again, I'm streaming this to my old YouTube channel. That is fine. I'm not here to convince you of my worldview. I'm here to provide value. And hopefully once we get into this article, maybe you'll be able to hear things or learn things you're not familiar with. So I'm not here to convert anybody. If what I say is interesting and you dive deeper into it, then glory to God, and so be it. But if you don't agree with me, that is fine. You are more than welcome to be here as well. So I just wanted to lay that out there. So anyways, with that being said, guys, smash that like. I greatly appreciate everybody being here. It's so good to see many of the familiar names here. It looks like Young Old Boy throws in $2 Canadian. What is that? 60 cents? I'm kidding. Thank you, Young Old Boy. God bless you, bro. He says, gang, 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 gang. Pre-less, so good. Yeah, what is that? I think he's referencing the new NPC thing going on TikTok where people like act like a robot, an NPC robot, and people send them coins and stuff. Yeah, I'm not going to be doing that, but thank you very much, old young boy, for the $2 super chat. And Christopher Shame throws in $5.55. He says, thoughts on Ibogaine and uses to treat opioid addiction. I had an Orthodox therapist friend who recommended it. Yeah, I've looked into Ibogaine, not as certainly that is not a fun psychedelic. And again, I'm not here. I do not advocate for inebriation. I'm not here to advocate for intoxication. But what I want to say is Ibogaine does seem to have many positive correlations with people with serious opioid addiction. And it's a bit of a traumatic experience. I've never done Ibogaine, so maybe I'm speaking out of turn here. For somebody who has, they would be much, much more astute on the nuances. But from my understanding, Ibogaine is part of a shamanic tradition out of Africa. And it's a bit of a traumatic experience in the sense that you kind of go through a lot of disassociation and physical pain. And through that, once you come out of it, it's a euphoric experience. So people take the substance because it sort of purges you. Again, or ayahuasca, anybody's done that, an ayahuasca ceremony knows that you go through a purge, you throw up quite a bit into a bucket. Ibogaine, from my understanding, is also a sort of bodily purging. It's much more disassociative. It's much more traumatic than an ayahuasca, a tryptamine. Again, that's another tryptamine type molecule. But I have heard that it has very good correlations with like meth addiction, again, opioid addiction or whatnot. So I don't know, but I do think that some of these boundary dissolving substances can there be a medical use of them? I think absolutely. I think the science is fairly clear that there's been a lot of positive outcomes with people with various addictions or traumas. In regards to just doing it for fun, I don't think many people are doing ibogaine for fun. The other ones people absolutely are doing for fun. And that's where I would personally would warn people, just watch out for any of the spiritual openings that opens you up to. Again, I had an experience with a friend that I initiated him into an LSD session. And I remember this is back like 2012. So this is a long time ago, 11 years ago. But I remember we did LSD and we were just listening to like Alan Watts at the time. And I was sitting there like lotus posture, eyes closed, the visuals, the intensity was getting ready to come on. You could see the tracers and the colors. And he just started freaking out. And literally within like a snap of fingers, he like became a different person. And he was like that for about 4.5 hours. And then I remember it was cold outside. We were all outside. I put a sweatshirt over him. Again, he was sort of, disassociated, wasn't responding to his name or anything. Put the sweatshirt on and he was like back. He's like, "Hey, Pat, what's going on, man?" And I said, "Bro, like, where you been, man?" And he's like, "Man, I've been talking to this goddess." And so, yeah, he went on this whole adventure talking about this goddess and his life and traumas that he got over and all this different stuff. But very strange experience. So again, anybody that goes into high dose psychedelic experiences, be careful because you are opening yourself up to something for sure. George throws in $3 and he says, "Great stream." Well, thank you so much, George. God bless you, brother. I really do appreciate the support. Thank you very much. And then, my buddy, Bone Man 538. Damn, son. Bone Man 538 throws in $110. Thank you so much, Bone Man 538. God bless you, brother. And by the way, man, I've been working on your sponsored stream. I plan on doing that next week. So God willing, I'll have that done next week. But it's a dense read. It's a dense read. But thank you so much, brother. He says thank you, man, for the $110 super chat. Very, very generous. I truly, truly do appreciate it. So a few quick announcement, guys. Again, this is a half and half video. So the second half of today's video is going to be up at the website. If you would like to see the second half, again, the second half of today's stream is going to be on my website, and it's going to be focusing on the use of inebriating substances, specifically in the Western esoteric traditions, beginning in modernity, which is, again, the fall of Byzantium, generally speaking. It's not like it's a hard, fast rule, but generally speaking, that's the demarcation. And so we're going to talk about the Italian Renaissance and Hermeticism and the Zohar and the Kabbalah, all this different stuff, alchemy, and the use of various substances, hashish, for example. So I think what we'll read up today, we're going to read 20 pages today. It approaches that topic, but it doesn't get fully into it. If you want to have access to the second half, you have to go in. It's $5 a month, the price of a cup of coffee, and you can have access to the second half of today's stream. Also, if anybody wants to set up a one-on-one session and talk about really anything that you're interested in, be it religion or spirituality or philosophy or goal setting, whatever it may be, you can do so with this link right here. This is the one-on-one link. You can then set up that, and we usually do those on Wednesday. So I'll be seeing some people tomorrow. Looking forward to that. Also, if anybody wants to sponsor a stream, again, we got some great sponsored streams. Bowman is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to be talking about John Scotus Erigena and his sort of Neoplatonism, and we're cloaked in a form of Christianity. It's actually pretty interesting. You're going to have to put your thinking cap on. We're going to be getting pretty intricate in regards to philosophy, but he's a pretty important person, especially when we start looking at the sort of Carolingian Empire. He's probably, I would argue, probably the top philosopher out of, or theologian, if you will, out of that. Now, he's not a saint. He's technically a heretic because his Neoplatonism, but again, a lot of interesting stuff. So we'll talk about that next week. And we got one from AC, and we got another one. I think there's a guy named Israel Anderson, some Gnostic guy online. So I'll be doing a takedown video, or at least looking at his spirituality. So if you have a sponsored topic, you want to sponsor a stream, feel free to do that. And so without further ado, guys, also we are on the move to 20,000 subs over here on Church of the Eternal Logos. We just broke 19.1K. So guys, please smash that like and subscribe. I'm really excited. The goal is to get to that 20,000 before my 34th birthday. So that is in September. So God willing, we're going to be able to make that. Also, if anybody has any Orthodox stuff, I know not everybody here is Orthodox, but if you are and you need to get icons or prayer ropes or books or anything you're looking for, go and check out orthodoxdepot.com and see if they have what you're looking for. You can put in promo code COTEL, COTEL, and you'll get 10% off. And it's a good American Midwestern company promoting Orthodoxy. So if you do have anything you need, you can help me out. It'll help you out, and you'll help some Orthodox brothers and sisters out over at Orthodox Depot. They've been a great sponsor of the show. Thank you so much, Orthodox Depot. Really appreciate it. And then finally, we need 5 more YouTube members over here on Church of the Eternal Logos, and we get a new emoji, of which, ironically, perfect for today's topic. I need 5 new members, and I got a Terrence McKenna emoji that I can put for you guys. So again, we got all the best emojis here for members. We got the crying NPC, the Giga Chad, the atheist Fedora, the beautiful trans man or woman or whatever you want to, the crying Jordan Peterson, Hulk Hogan. Again, so much stuff. I'm putting them all out here so you guys can see it. I need 5 more new members. If you're already a member, it's not for you. It's somebody who's not a member yet, like Ed the Wave. Right? I see Ed the Wave out there. I need Ed the Wave or Thomas Henderson or Ortho Eric. Become a YouTube member. I need 5 people and we get a new emoji. So just want to throw that out there. Okay, now with that being said, now let's get into the actual paper and some of the topic that I want to address with you guys tonight. So here we go. This, again, as I said, is a paper that I wrote for my doctoral program. And so it was titled Tracing Esoteric Technologies for Transcendence, the Spiritual Use of Psychoactive Drugs from Eleusis to Crowley. So we're going to move through this. It may take us a minute, but we're going to read. This is a 41-page paper. Probably the last 2 pages are bibliography. And I think we're going to read the first 19 pages. So the first 19 pages. But anyways, feel free to buckle in here. And if you'd like to show some love, feel free to send in a super chat either on YouTube or through Streamlabs, the Streamlabs link. And I would greatly appreciate that. Okay. Introduction. The ritualistic use of inebriating substances for spiritual purposes has a long and ancient history in world religions. This paper will be tracing the general use of psychoactive substances from the ancient mystery rites up and through the Western esoteric traditions of the 19th century. To cover such a large breadth of historical time, this paper will only be a general and very brief overview. The goal is to recognize the thread of religious practice and identify consistent theological trends concerning the historic phenomenon of drug-induced mysticism. This paper will build upon scholarship of Christopher Partridge by identifying psychedelic use as a historical facet of the Western esoteric traditions and describing psychoactive substances as technologies, deriving from the Greek techne, which means an art, skill, craft, and work, a way, manner, or means whereby a thing is gained. Psychoactive substances will be understood as techniques or technologies of transcendence. Thereby, drugs provide a technological means to a mystical end. Mircea Eliade hints at a similar concept in his very important and groundbreaking 20th century work, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. Though criticized by scholars regarding his classification of narcotic shamanism as decadent, Eliade's work is still a foundational study in the investigation of tribal shamanism and identifies drug use along with others as transcendent techniques for religious ecstasy. This paper is attempting to establish what Walter Hanegraaff has called contemporary and theogenic esotericism, a historical thread of magical practice found throughout the history of Western magic, Despite this paper stopping short of major 20th century figures such as Aldous Huxley, Timothy Leary, and Terence McKenna, the role of psychoactive substances within the Western esoteric traditions is known to have had a tremendous impact upon the 1960s counterculture as well as the 21st century. A considerable amount of scholarship has established drug-induced mysticism as a religious practice in the ancient period. Such examples include the use of LSD-like alkaloids among the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, Hayoma ingestion within the Mithraic mysteries of Persia and Rome, Amanita muscaria consumption in Siberian shamanism, as well as theories regarding the enigmatic identity of the Vedic god Soma, of which I'm going to mention it in this paper, but I want to do even a fuller explanation of the Soma mystery, because I believe something that nobody's talked about, be it McKenna or anybody in the sort of psychedelic community, is Armenia. Armenia, I believe the key to solving the Soma mystery regarding the Rig Veda and the Indo-European religion in India, the inebriating god Soma, it has to do with the Mithraic rituals present in Armenia that are even can be found in very, very small, so not many people, but still can be potentially found in the mountains of Armenia today. That will be another stream. However, I'll continue. I digress. The Vedic god Soma. However, this paper is more concerned with tracing the general use of drugs for spiritual purposes from the ancient period into modernity by way of the Western esoteric traditions. As medieval and Gnostic heresies emerged in Western Europe, so does evidence of potential psychedelic mushroom use with some of these groups. In the medieval period, the normalization of opium and hashish use for religious experience was also established in 13th century Spain by way of Sufi mystics. The Iberian Peninsula under Islamic rule was a place of immense mystical syncretism between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This is also the same time that the book The Zohar, those are familiar with the Kabbalah, that's the same time that that was written. So mystical syncretism between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, providing fertile ground for a perennialistic spiritual beliefs, as well as the use of psychoactive substances as technologies for mystical transcendence. As the Inquisition persecuted groups such as the Knights Templar, and part due to Gnostic Christian heresies, it forced Templar loyalists to flee north for safe harbor in Scotland. This is the beginning of Scottish Freemasonry. It is there where Templars are believed to have then formalized their heretic, ancient, inebriating practices rooted in the mysteries of Eleusis as rites within Scottish Freemasonry. The Inquisition also saw an immense persecution of witches due to accusations of magically using intoxicating drugs. Though many believe these charges were over-exaggerated, scholars have argued that indeed some psychedelic plants were undoubtedly known and used within European witchcraft. Thereby, this paper argues that from ancient mystery rites to 19th century figures such as Helena Blavatsky and Aleister Crowley, the use of psychoactive substances have made their way into the contemporary spiritual milieu, most notably through the esoteric magical traditions of Western Europe. Okay, so pre-modern use of psychoactives. Let's go there. Okay, the root word for mystery comes from the Greek word mystes, meaning one initiated. For traditions such as tribal shamanism or ancient mystery rites, it is the ingestion of psychoactive substances that transport the initiate into the presence of the mysterion, the revealed secret. Psychoactive technologies act as spiritual catalysts into the mystical religious secret and have roots dating back to prehistory. Before the erection of major metropolitan cities or even alphabetical language, for certain traditions, drugs and religious experience were inexorably linked. Given the radical quality of psychedelic experiences, it is no surprise that knowledge and ritual use of such substances would be perpetuated into the 21st century. As history progressed forward and tribal spiritual practices became more systematized, local cults evolved into religious groups. One of the emergent novelties of this transition is the development of doctrine. As Max Weber argued, religious doctrine is one of the outstanding marks of rational development from the prehistoric period to the rise of religious priesthood. As the specialized role of the priest emerges, so does the size and scope of societies. And the tribal setting, the shaman performs the local function of healer, prophet, magician, and is the primary spiritual mediator between the tribe and divinity. However, with the emergence of metropolitan cities, the priest takes over for the local role of the shaman. Quote, priests work for the entire tribe or nation, or in any case, for a society of some sort. Now, that is a quote from Shamanism, Mircea Eliade. During this During this transition, it has been speculated that exoteric tribal use of inebriants moved into the more obscure domain of the esoteric. Relegated for an initiated elite priesthood, psychoactive use became limited, available only to a certain privileged individual. Contrast this with tribal shamanic inebriation in the Amazon, where exoteric rituals can involve the participation of the entire group. Due to mere logistics of growing cities and formalized traditions, drug-induced mysticism had to be limited to a smaller group of worthy participants. What I'm hinting at there is the Brahmins of India. So as the Rig Veda moved into the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and all this stuff, the Brahmanic priesthood, who was at one point in charge of the use of Soma, the inebriating god Soma, it was a publicly, people knew what Soma was, and they participated in this ritual. As cities grew, as time went forward, that secret was relegated more and more and more just to the priesthood. Eventually, even among the priesthood, has been totally forgotten. And I contrast this with Amazonian shamanism, where we can look at various ayahuasquero cults where the entire groups gets inebriated. And this is where even Terence McKenna talked about the phenomenon of synesthesia, where the shaman then sings his icaros, and the icaros then become physical presentations, visual presentations, where shamans can shoot arrows, they can do various things with their songs with words. So words then become visible, if you see what I'm saying. And many of you speculated about the role of language here, and Terence McKenna was very much interested in magic and language because of this, but I digress. That's what was being hinted at in that paragraph there. Of these ancient mysteries, none have been more debated among scholars and psychonauts than the enigmatic identity of Soma. Theories have abound concerning the Rig Veda's psychedelic god Soma. Candidates for the ethnobotanical identity include Pagamen harmala, cannabis, Amanita muscaria, Psilocybe cubensis, to name a few. Whatever Soma's identity, whatever Soma's identity, we most likely will never know. The rise of Vedic culture brought about the Brahmanic priesthood, which shrouded this inebriating brew in mystery. The knowledge of who and what intoxicating god Soma was eventually became lost. Yet what is important to note is in the example of Vedic religion, ancient drug use was moved from the exoteric identity of an important deity to a forgotten esoteric inebriating brew. Ancient mystery traditions using psychoactive substances for ritual purposes was not uncommon. For a few examples would include the Zoroastrian mysteries of Persia, the mesmeric mysteries of Rome, the Isis mysteries of Egypt, and the Eleusinian mysteries of Greece. The ancient mystery tradition worth considerable importance regarding the tracing of technology of transcendence is the great Eleusinian mysteries. The Eleusinian mystery was an annual secret religious ceremony held in honor of the Greek goddess Demeter and Persephone. This ceremony was a major spectacle of the ancient world and is thought to have initiated participants into the regenerative rebirth of Persephone and symbolized the mystery of eternal life. A popular theory explaining the esoteric nature of the psychedelic ritual of ancient Greece was the 1978 book, The Road to Eleusis by classicist Carl A.P. Ruck, chemist and inventor of LSD Albert Hofmann, and amateur mycologist R. Gordon Wasson. In it, they put their various research specialties together to argue that the perplexing identity of the Kikekion was in fact a mind-altering, ergotized psychoactive beverage. The Kikekion was the central brew of the Eleusinian mysteries and was given to those participants who would be initiated into the ancient gnosis of Persephone's death and rebirth. The scholars theorized the Kikekion to be an inebriating drink filled with the alkaloids ergotamine, a known precursor to LSD, which can induce hallucinatory effects. Ergotamine comes from ergot, and this fungal parasite of barley and rye grain may be the necessary ingredient to unlocking this ancient esoteric rite. Since the theory was put forth, more evidence has come to light in Girona, Spain, regarding ergot fragments being found inside a vase within a temple dedicated to two Eleusinian goddesses, Demeter and Persephone. Others, such as the Hungarian classicist and philologist Karl Kerényi, have speculated in association with Papaver somniferum, a famous opium poppy known from the ancient Greeks and visibly held by the goddess in certain works of art. Multiple other theories have emerged regarding the exact identity of the intoxicating substance in question, from various mushroom species to dimethyltryptamine. However, the original theory of Ruck, Hoffman, and Wasson still holds considerable weight for many scholars. Drinking the elixir of immortality has been a central obsession for much of ancient magical traditions. How does one reach the perfected state of eternity? Is it achievable in this world? Questions such as these have been a fundamental goal of magical practice, from Taoist immortals roaming the mountains of China to the Western alchemical pursuit for the philosopher's stone. Escaping the mortal confines of this world was the ultimate and magical prize. This concept is the basic premise of the popular book by Brian Morescu, The Immortality Key, attempting to make the case that the inebriating cults of ancient Greece and Rome were continued under the guise of Christianity. Morescu argues that the Christian Eucharist is in reality a misunderstood psychedelic remnant of ancient mystery traditions. The same quest for immortality by way of the elixir of life was reformulated into a sober doctrinal amalgamation of ancient Greco-Roman practices. Though no one can doubt the contextual historical influence Christianity emerges out of, this book simply lacks the scholastic rigor to make such an argument academically tenable. Yeah. So Morescu's book, The Immortality Key, is crap. As an academic interested in this stuff, it's absolutely ridiculous. It has no philosophical nuance at all. Philosophical or historical nuance. It jumps between Gnostic gospels, canonical gospels, Gnostic practices, heretical practices, equating this to Christianity, all this different stuff. Morescu's work fails to address fundamental paradigmatic differences between what was established as the Orthodox Church's theology through the ecumenical councils of the first millennium and the innumerable Gnostic traditions that surrounded it. It is true Christianity shares semiotic similarities with the inebriating Dionysian and Mithraic cults of the ancient period. However, Morescu conflates specific Gnostic examples as massive generalizations concerning the entirety of Christian theology proper. The word concept fallacy is a failure to recognize that similar terms and concepts can have very different meanings when analyzed in their specific theological context. Traditional Christianity adopted the Stoic virtue of sobriety. Sobriety was a virtue that informs how dogmatic Christianity theologically interprets the process of divination, or I should probably call that deification. Immortality and death. Despite general similarities, this can have a profound difference in overall meaning. Theological nuance is lacking in the Immortality Key when addressing how different concepts are understood within the paradigms of pagan mystery rites, Orthodox Christian theology, and beliefs among competing Gnostic schools. Morescu never claims to be a religious studies scholar, but if he had such a background, maybe some of these shortcomings could have been avoided. As R. Gordon Wasson and his wife, Valentina Pavlovna, showed, Slavic linguistic and cultural affiliations to mushrooms and mushroom picking are much stronger in the East than that of Western European peoples. This linguistic relationship was documented in their book, Mushrooms, Russia, and History. It would seem that if the psychedelic Eucharistic theory was a true general characterization for all of Christianity, it would have been most prevalent in the Eastern Church, where the converted pagan traditions of the Slavs already had strong affiliations with such practices. Of the Western nations with linguistic evidence of a mushroom tradition are those of the French and Italian, two countries that will play particular prominence when Gnostic heresies emerge in the medieval period. This is an important nuance to keep in mind as we trace these technologies of transcendence into modernity. Okay. So what still needs to be addressed then is, how did these technologies for transcendence continue from the ancient world and into the modern period? What seems most reasonable is by way of specific heretical Gnostic Eucharistic practices in search for spiritual gnosis that were syncretistic with ancient mystery rites. In fact, the idea that Gnosticism was in some sense the continuation of ancient mystery rites is supported by scholar Kurt Rudolph in his book, Gnosis, The Nature and History of Gnosticism, which I have right down here. It is in this connection is also necessary to indicate the part played by the Hellenistic mystery religions in the formation of Gnosis. It is well known that the organization of the Gnostic communities was not dissimilar to that of the mystery religions. The basic ideas of the individual mystery religions, which were seldom summed up in proper theology, example given in the Egyptian mysteries of Isis, found a certain echo in Gnosis. It is not impossible that specific traditions of the mystery religions found acceptance in certain Gnostic communities, the Ophites, the Nicene, traditions which encompasses the common fate of the divinity and the faithful, and which seek to realize salvation by cultic means, as was the aim of the mystery cults. It may be the same contribution allegedly made by Orphism, an ancient Greek theosophical school connected with the cult of Dionysus, which exerted its influence more in secret than publicly. Okay. With that being said, one must be very specific. As Michael Williams has argued, Gnosticism is by no means a monolithic religious movement. Nevertheless, the point central to this thesis of this paper is that certain Gnostic groups were syncretic and continuous with the esoteric practices of the ancient mystery traditions. The fundamental distinction between Orthodox Christian theology and esoteric mysticism is much greater than scholars have generally acknowledged. As Thomas Kuhn showed in his criticism of scientific positivism, worldviews, in fact, are much more paradigmatic in nature and depend upon a network of beliefs and presuppositions to inform their epistemic validity. The presuppositions embedded within psychedelic mysticism, esoteric magical traditions, and ancient mystery cults are consistent with a specific perennial spiritual paradigm. The emphasis on personal experience and illumination may not be the central focus of more exoteric Orthodox theological practices. This paradigmatic difference helps better characterize the canonical church's intense conflict with perceived heresies. This is more than a difference in doctrine, but a difference in paradigms. Consequently, it is not just that esoteric spirituality is the other side of the proverbial coin, but rather it is an entirely different coin than that of dogmatic Christianity. The works of Carl A.P. Ruck, such as The Apples of Apollo, Pagan and Christian Mysteries of the Eucharist, The Affluence of Deity, Alchemy and Psychoactive Sacraments in Medieval and Renaissance Art, Dionysius in Thrace, and Mushrooms, Myth and Mithras, The Drug Cult That Civilized Europe, lend credence to the idea that the psychoactive substance technologies were perpetuated within esoteric rites. This paper departs from the theories of Ruck insofar that psychoactive mysticism or various esoteric rites are the authentic basis for Orthodox Christianity. This paper certainly recognizes that many semiotic similarities between Christianity and various mystery traditions. However, concerning the analysis of paradigms, specifically in regards to metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology, esoteric magical traditions tend to have more in common with each other across historical, geographical, and cultural variations than often the dogmatic Orthodox religious traditions they may spring from. Ruck presents evidence that the cults of Mithras, Dionysius, Manichaeanism, and some Gnostic sects were known users of inebriating substances. This is important concerning explanations for the appearance of psychedelic-themed medieval Christian frescoes. Manichaean and Gnostic heresies, such as the Cathars, were persecuted during the Inquisition, not only for their beliefs, but questions concerning the validity and sanctity of their sacraments. Mani, the founder of Manichaeanism, was believed to be a magical healer of sorts who had spent time studying with the Brahmins of India, the same priest class that was commissioned to guard the secret identity of the inebriating god Soma. Manichaeanism has a multitude of syncretic beliefs that puts it into a much more conducive religious paradigm with many of the ancient mystery rites. In fact, with Manichaeanism, we find a connection not only to India and ancient Greece, but also to that of Persian Zoroastrianism, all of which had esoteric inebriating traditions. Describing the nature of Manichaean beliefs and their reemergence in the Middle Ages, Ruck writes, Manichaeanism is an ascetic, celibate, vegetarian, communal, visionary cult syncretistic with Neo-Pythagoreanism, Gnosticism, Brahmanism, and Zoroastrianism, believing in the dualism of darkness and light, of the flesh and spirit, and seeking to liberate the latter from the former through a luminous mystery, which could be accomplished by drinking of a cup. The cult was usually accused of sorcery. It apparently went underground and surfaced once again in Armenia in the 7th century as Polytheism, and in the 10th in Bulgaria as Bogomilism, both of which are Christian Gnostic heresies, Polytheism and Bogomilism. And again in southern France from the 11th to the 13th century as a confraternity of the Albigensians, also known as the Cathars, perhaps through ideas brought back by the Crusaders, and as the Cathars, so called because they were purified by some mystery. But it was again suppressed by Pope Innocent III. Throughout these periods of suppression and renewed heresies, no doubt neo-pagan continuations of classical rites encouraged the Manichaean concept of Satanism, persisted as cults of witchcraft, syncretistic with Druidism. The line of entheogenic transmission provides much more historical plausibility than the general claims of the immortality key. Manichaeanism was known to use inebriating substances for religious purposes. They were often accused of magic and sorcery, and they had a reputation for the eating of mushrooms, and their ultimate mystery was drunk in a cup. Another characteristic worth noting is their veneration of Jesus, the Buddha, and Zarathustra. Perennialism, especially after the Renaissance, is a pronounced feature of not only magical practices, but of psychedelic mysticism. Ruck also addresses the possibility of crusading groups, such as the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitallers, encountering these living ancient practices within the Holy Land. This claim is supported by medieval scholars Walter L. Wakefield and Jeffrey Burton Russell. Russell notes that during the medieval period, there was a significant Catholic suspicion surrounding the origin of the Templars' magical Oriental heresies. Combine this with the fact that Manichaean Gnostic heresies common to Eastern sects such as Polytheism and Bogomilism reappear in Western Europe by way of Catharism around the same time of returning Crusaders. Wakefield argues that there is convincing evidence that the Bogomils of Bulgaria and Constantinople were closely connected with the Cathars of Western Europe. In addition, it is worth noting that pre-Christian Bulgaria had evidence of archaic mushroom monuments. Could these ancient practices have provided a cultural precedent for the spiritual use of technologies of transcendence which allowed easier reappropriation with the rise of Bogomil Gnosticism? In addition to the work of Jerry and Julie Brown, the work of Jerry and Julie Brown have documented visual evidence of what appears to be Western Christian frescoes of psychoactive mushrooms. The vast majority of their evidence appears between the 11th and 14th centuries. The same time, Gnostic and Manichaean practices made their way to the West from the East into places such as Italy, France, and Germany, all of which where the examples are found, all of which were a hotbed of medieval heresies of Gnosticism and witchcraft. In Italy, the 12th century baptistry of Parma not only portrays Christ standing upon what appears to be an Amanita muscaria mushroom, but above the southern door of the baptistry, displaying an engraving of Mithras, odd for a Christian baptistry, unless attempting to signify the true lineage in which these psychoactive sacraments made their way from the ancient world. The mushroom tree fresco made emphasis by John Marco Allegro's The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross resides in the 12th century Plain Choralt Chapel, a chapel built for and by none other than the Knights Hospitallers, furthering the claims that crusading knights and Gnostic sects being the preservers of these ancient rites. The answer to how these practices emerge in Christendom is not by way of the Orthodox Church harboring ancient secret rituals, but rather within the heretical traditions that are as old as and competed with dogmatic Christianity. One only had to read the opening chapter of Hippolytus's Refutation of All Heresies to read that he believed many of the Gnostic groups he condemns to be the continuations of ancient mystery traditions. When defining the magical Christology of the Ophites and the Nicene, Hippolytus states that the Son of Man from the unportrayable Logos is in fact the great and unspeakable mystery of the Eleusinian rites. describing how the Ophites and the Nicene understood themselves and their mystery rites of a Gnostic Christ as the full realization of the Eleusinian mysteries. Hippolytus writes, quote, "For the mystery is called Eleusin or Anactorium. Eleusin, because he says, we are spiritual, come flowing down from Adam above. For the word Eleusthai is he says, of the same import with the expression to come, but Anactorion is of the same import with the expression to ascend upwards. This, he says, is what they affirm who have been initiated into the mysteries of the Eleusinians. It is, however, a regulation of law that those who have been admitted into the lesser should again be initiated into the greater mysteries. For destins obtain greater portions, but the inferior mysteries, he says, are of Persephone below." Clearly, some Gnostic groups in the ancient period very publicly confessed to be the fuller continuation of the inebriating mystery rites of old. The appearance of psychedelically themed frescoes in Western Europe are part of a larger preservation of these technologies of transcendence used in ancient mystery rites of Gnosis, heresies in traditional Christianity's eyes that go directly back to the pagan mysteries of old. Researching heretical Eucharist will reveal a multitude of Gnostic groups that trace their lineage to traditions pre-existing Christianity. One example is again the Ophites, similar to another group known as the Sethians, who were inspired by serpent veneration coming out of Egypt. In their admiration for the serpent in the Garden of Eden, the Ophites reportedly had a snake kiss the Eucharistic bread for consecration. Mani and his followers in the 3rd century were described to have Eucharistic meals consisting specifically of mushrooms with all-night agape feast, quote, which included magic, drugs, and rites of sexual obscenity, unquote. That's from Carl A.P. Ruck. That's not my words. So the Carpocratians also celebrated their agape feast with a sexual orgy that was both wow, that's supposed to be homo and hetero and homosexual. The Borborites were accused of consuming a Eucharist covered in menstrual blood and semen. The accusations of sexual promiscuity and ritual intoxication can be found in the polemical writings of many Christian church fathers. Irenaeus wrote in Against Heresies that the Carpocratian used magical pharmakia in the form of philters and love potions. Eusebius describes Simon Magus and his followers worshiping Simon and Helen of Troy as deities by way of intoxicating incense and sacrifices and libations. In the Panarion, Epiphanius describes ritual sex and drunkenness practiced by the Borborites. In the Authoritative Discourse, a Gnostic text found in the Nag Hammadi library describes a, quote, food and medicine for the soul that once consumed gives esoteric perception to the mind. In the Amanita Muscaria rites of the Siberian shamanists, ethnographers have documented the prevalence of urine drinking after having consumed the psychoactive mushrooms. This is because the urine has filtered out many toxins and provides the ability to reuptake the inebriating ebotenic acid. This provides the shaman or another participant with the ability to become more intoxicated without risking consumption of more toxins. Interestingly, the same Gnostic and Manichaean Cathars of southern France, who may very well be responsible for some of the frescoes presented by Jerry and Julie Brown, quote, brought with them filthy sacrament of the divine affluence like urine, unquote. This practice of ritual urine drinking by the Cathars may be a Gnostic practice continuous with the Borborites, as Ruck, and this is Carl A.P. Ruck, highlights the name Borborites was a pejorative term generically meaning filth eaters. More recently, evidence has emerged in Armenia that furthers the possibility of Gnostic groups participating in the same ancient Amanita Muscaria rituals. Scholar Robert Bedrosian, in an article titled Soma Among the Armenians, analyzed Argord and Wasson's speculation of the Amanita Muscaria mushrooms being the central intoxicant of the Indo-European ritual concerning the god Soma. He notes that there is considerable historical and cultural evidence to tie ancient Armenia as being participants in the same ritual use of mushrooms, as found in the Vedic religion of India and Persia. However, unlike India and Persia, who eventually stopped the use of Amanita muscaria, whether due to weather change or the loss of tradition, Armenia continued this practice all the way into the early 20th century. This places Gnostic cults such as the Paulicians and the Borborites in a place not only where Gnostic groups are welcomed and thrived, Armenia, but also in a context where there is an ancient and continuous historical use of psychoactive mushrooms. Block quote, one suspects that members of the numerous pagan and Christian cults and sects which thrived across the highlands may have understood things differently and may have had use of the abundant ethnobotanicals readily available to them, including the Amanita muscaria mushroom, for magical, religious, and sexual purposes. A surviving Armenian magical text also suggests this. Unlike the Iranian and Indian societies which abandoned Amanita, Armenian societies apparently held it dear. Though it is in folk culture rather than in the world of the priest and literary histories that is reflected, elements of the Soma ceremony itself survived among the Armenian population of Central and Eastern Asia Minor until the second decade of the 20th century. That'd be, again, the Armenian genocide. Medieval scholars have argued that the Armenian Paulicians, who eventually fled to places such as Bulgaria and potentially to parts of Western Europe, influenced the practices and beliefs of the Cathars. Given the historical practices of Amanita muscaria use in Armenia and it being a harbinger of a multitude of Christian heretical groups during this period, it is plausible that the filthy sacrament of urine drinking among the Cathars was a practice learned from the Gnostic groups existing in Armenia. This provides some explanation for Amanita's presence in Western Christian frescoes, as well as an explanation for the evidence found by Jerry and Julie Brown in Turkey, which were in very close proximity to Armenia, where these practices were preserved. Due to the Inquisition, many Gnostic and Manichaean cults began to be quelled and persecuted. This included not only the Cathars, but also the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar were, quote, accused of urinating on a crucifix and of obscene sexual rituals of initiation. This is where they were accused of kissing the mushroom head of a man's penis and also like kissing the butt of another initiate. So you can look into this. I quote here, looks like I quote Robert Bedrosian, a practice consistent with other Gnostic sects. And you can also find Carl A.P. Ruck talks about this as well in medieval and Renaissance art. It's the red one that he has, the red book he has. The grave of a Templar found in Germany contained the same ophite talismanic seal related to those Gnostics who had previously venerated serpents. By 1314, Templar leaders were executed, forcing many to the north, where they fled primarily to Scotland, where their traditions survived in Freemasonry. And works such as Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma, as well as P.D. Newman's Alchemically Stone, the psychedelic secret of Freemasonry, Freemasons have claimed a direct lineage not only with the Templars, but one going back to Eleusis itself. The hermaphroditic god Baphomet, whom the Templars are purported to have worshipped, was believed by Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall to be a secret Ophite Gnostic initiation ritual. Baphomet comes from the Greek baphe and metis, which together translate as baptism of wisdom. Could this wisdom be the ancient psychedelic mystery rite of death and rebirth? Could this be why Wolfram von Eschenbach referred to the Knights of the Holy Grail as baptized men? Whether or not Baphomet was a literal god worshipped or the name of an esoteric Gnostic initiation isn't of interest here. What is important is that according to Freemasonry, the Scottish York Rite comes directly from those Knights Templar who fled Southern Europe for safe harbor in Scotland. Newman even writes that they were the psychedelic guardians of the authentic Grail tradition. Is it any coincidence that the 15th century Rosslyn Chapel, the Scottish chapel where Jerry and Julie Brown identified anatomically correct Amanita muscaria mushrooms in the forehead of the Green Man, has a direct connection back to the Crusading Templar Knights? Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, appears to have been a Templar sympathizer and was ruling Scotland at the time the Templars were being executed during the Inquisition. He even went so far as to wanting his embalmed heart to accompany a crusade be buried in the Holy Land of Jerusalem. Sir William Sinclair, who is described to have been a Templar, fought with Robert the Bruce during the Battle of Bannockburn for Scottish independence. 150 years later, Sir William, his descendant, built Rosslyn Chapel near Edinburgh. This is a quote coming from Carl A.P. Ruck. So he says, his ancestor, Henry St. Clair, 1st Earl of Rosslyn, had served on the First Crusade with Hogue de Payen, 1st Grand Master of the Knights Templar, and Hogue visited Rosslyn in 1126, where he was given the land where the chapel now stands. It is claimed, and also denied, that Rosslyn is replete with Masonic and Templar symbolism built on the plan of Herod's temple. The Sinclairs even claim that they had the lineage of Jesus through the marriage of Mary Magdalene. The Sinclair clan even claim a blood relationship with Jesus through the infamous Gnostic marriage with Mary Magdalene, providing more probability it was Gnostic and Manichaean heresies, be it with crusading knights or the Cathars, that preserve the esoteric mysteries of ancient religions. This paper argues that as Orthodox Christianity attempted to differentiate itself from the ancient pagan world in the first millennium, Christianity stood in dialectical tension with many groups more sympathetic to pagan practices. Specific Gnostic groups saw themselves as both Christian and the preservers of other ancient mysteries, of which was the use of psychoactive sacraments. And post-schism Christendom, both the Eastern Orthodox and the Latin West persecute such heresies. They eventually go underground during the medieval period and move to Northern Europe to become grafted into traditions such as Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism. The knowledge of intoxicating plants and herbs, as well as the inquisitional punishments of those who ritually used them, was not limited to Gnostics and the Templars. Those accused of witchcraft were also often believed to be participating in inebriating rituals. The legends of mystical flight by witches are believed by many scholars to, quote, be by use of hallucinatory drugs taken orally or rubbed upon the skin. Often the skin regarding their vulva, and this is where we get, at least I've heard Michael Harner, for example, he's a promoter of neo-shamanism. Michael Harner has a book, I actually have it over here, where he has a whole article arguing that European witchcraft and the idea of the witch flying on the broomstick was actually tied to rubbing psychoactive herbs and ointments on a broomstick and then either putting it in their vulva or putting their vulva on top of the broomstick. And this is how then they would, get high. And this is then the metaphor for them flying on a broomstick. Take that what you will, but I cite here Witchcraft in the Middle Ages by Russell. And I know Michael Harner also has a whole chapter in his book. Similar descriptions to the shamanic mystical flight described by Mircea Eliade. This belief regarding witchcraft transcends the medieval period and can be found in legends throughout the 18th century. Important for the purposes of this paper is that witchcraft is a further association of ritual intoxication for magical spiritual purposes. And the quest for personal illumination by way of esoteric gnosis, certain Gnostic sects were syncretic with the mystery traditions of old and preserved their psychedelic rituals. By way of inebriating substances and esoteric magical rituals, initiates were brought into the presence of the mystery. As Europe enters into modernity, the gnosis of the spiritual use of technologies of transcendence will be found in the realms of magic, witchcraft, alchemy, and the occult, placing psychoactive use as consistent trend of the Western esoteric traditions all the way into the 20th century. And this is where we're going to stop. This is page 19. The rest gets into the spread of cannabis and hashish by way of Sufism. Then it gets into opium use and all that stuff, moving into Aleister Crowley in the 20th century. So again, we're going to stop there. Smash that like for everybody who's here. I greatly appreciate that. But the rest is going to be saved for the second half, which is going to be on the website. So I just want to throw that out there. So guys, smash that like for everybody who's still here. It looks like we didn't get any members over on the YouTube. So again, a salve of datura on the witches, I thought, to fly on the broom. Well, yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about. Bubby Blindy. It's debated, but I know Michael Harner and again Russell. He's a medieval scholar, and he is an expert on witchcraft. And in his book, he is kind of the ultimate. I think it's a major university press. I forget what I think Oxford, but he argues that they put some type of ointment on the broomstick, and this is where we get the understanding of the witch flying on the broom or something of that nature. He said, Bill Hicks, glad you're with us here, Bill Hicks. He says, damn, doing the Dyer half and half. I need to subscribe to your website now. Yeah, exactly. And Dyer gave me the idea. He's like, man, you got to do more half and halves. And so that's exactly what I'm doing. And I'll be doing a lot more of those. So please do, Bill Hicks, please. Again, to get access to the second half of this stream where we go into the rest of this paper, you'll need to become a website member for $5 a month. That is this link right here that I just shared with everybody. Grant H says, can dark music affect me? I tend to still love dark music. Well, it depends on what you mean by dark music. If you're talking about like heavy metal, there's heavy metal group. I know Father Turbo is into heavy metal, and he has some Christian groups. You can reach out to him, Grant. If you're talking about things that are obviously like satanic, yeah, that's probably going to have a detrimental effect on you. It was likely black hembane on the broomstick. Yeah, there's many arguments. I have a book. I have a few books over there on witchcraft, and a few by proponents of psychedelic spirituality, and they debate. But I have heard hembane. I think the majority of scholars believe it was henbane. So that I think that puts you basically in the same situation of most scholars I've read. But there are other ointments and salves that they've argued for. So yeah, just throwing that out there. Yeah, and as I've also heard of datura, as Bubby Blindy says, great name there. Ed the Wave says, not much different that what these nasty be doing nowadays. Still, you'd be surprised what you'd find on Reddit. Yeah, I don't want to go on Reddit. I'll leave that to you, Ed the Wave. God bless you, bro, for diving into the dark waters of Reddit. Bill Hicks says, thanks someone in one of these chats turned me on to them. Well, great. Will Emmanuel, shout out to Will Emmanuel. He says, I tend to not to listen to lyrics anymore in fear I will stop liking some music. Turns out most are full of it. Yeah, I have a nice lo-fi playlist I like to listen to that has no words in it. But all right, guys, that is going to do it for me tonight. Smash that like again to get the second half of this stream. I'll be recording the second half tomorrow, and I should have it up on the website by tomorrow night, God willing. And then I got a debate with Bryson Gray, the MAGA rapper. I got a debate with him Thursday night, which that should be interesting. We'll be doing that Thursday night. I'm going to be streaming that over on Church of the Eternal Logos, and then we'll be doing an open panel Friday evening on do psychedelics lead to enlightenment? And so if somebody is pro psychedelics and they are very much in favor of psychedelics, they will be able to come on and make their case publicly. And we can then debate what is enlightenment and how does one reach in, and do psychedelics aid one in reaching spiritual enlightenment? So we're going to be doing an open debate panel Friday evening. So if anybody wants to voice their opinion or opposition or in favor of, you will be able to do that then. So, well, Emmanuel said, did you do your Bible quizzes before the debate? Oh my gosh. No, I did not do my Bible quizzes, but it's going to be quite funny when I'm going to bring that up. I'm going to ask him if he did his quizzes for sure. It should be an annoying but fun debate for sure. Okay, yeah. Bill Hicks says, "Oh, that's going to be great. The open panel, can't wait." Yeah, I hope many people who are for psychedelics and against my worldview hop on so we can go back and forth. I think that'd be really useful. So that's the hope for Friday evening. So, anyways, I am going to hop off here. I will see you guys Thursday during the debate. If you come watch that on my channel, again, we'll stream it. It'll be on the Crucible and it'll be on my channel. And then I'll definitely be back Friday evening for an open panel debate on do psychedelics lead to enlightenment. Now, I want to give a special thank you again to young old boy Christopher Shame, and George throws in $3, and then a very, very, very special shout out to Boneman538 for the very generous super chat. Thank you so much, brother. I really, really do appreciate that. And so I will see you guys then. So until Thursday and Friday, as always, God bless.